Hi everyone. I've spoken with a lot of people this past month who are extremely anxious with all that is happening in our world. And often their fears are not helped when they spend time on social media and watching the news coverage and listening to politicians. A good example of this is about a week ago, a prominent politician was being pressed by a journalist, and the journalist was asking some legitimate questions of this politician regarding some of the secondary fallout that's going to come from the coronavirus, asking questions about mental health and economic devastation. And the politician didn't want to respond to these, and he said this. He said, quote, "The illness is death. What is worse than death?" Unquote. And they went back and forth several times, and the politician kept coming back to this question, well, what is worse than death? Implying that there is nothing worse than death. Well, these are scary times, and we are politically divided, and I don't want to dive into the politics today, but I do want to speak to this question. Are there things worse than death? Because I believe there are. In fact, I know there are. What many people fear right now with this virus and all of the potential fallout is pretty close to my own heart and to my wife's heart. As most of you know, this past Sunday, my family and I commemorated what would have been my daughter Maria's 8th birthday. We lost her 4 years ago on March 4th, and our lives have never been the same. She was a healthy and happy, spunky little girl that was almost 4 years old. One day she got sick, and it was a normal illness for several days. And then on that dreaded Friday night, when I was laying her in her bed and she had no previous health conditions, no other signs of anything going wrong, she died in my arms when I was laying her down. And so if you can imagine just the devastation that we have gone through and the fear. And we didn't know at the time what she died from. My wife Jill was 9 months pregnant. She was due any day. And so we were terrified for my wife's pregnancy and this newborn, like innocent but very vulnerable baby that was born. And then 2 days after Maria died, our next youngest daughter at the time, Sadie, who was 2.5 years old at the time, she got a fever and she got sick, and we didn't know what had killed Maria. And so I just remember just the absolute terror of driving her to the emergency room in the middle of the night. My heart was racing, just in utter shock and terror. We wouldn't find out what Maria died of until a month later when we got the autopsy report. And basically it was this. She got influenza A. And for whatever reason, her body didn't fight it off. She's like the 1 in 100,000 case scenario of a healthy child that gets a virus, and she died. And she died of what's called myocarditis. The virus wasn't fought off, and it attacked her heart and shut her heart down immediately. No signs or symptoms that we could have been aware of, and she died. And so my wife and I live in this constant state of fear for our children. You know, you imagine the worst case scenario. We've lived through it. And yet, another important question that we've had is this, because my natural tendency, what I want to do is put all my other children in a bubble, keep them isolated and safe. Because, you know, the reality is, my daughter Maria died from one of two things. She either caught the sickness from going to church or playing with her friends. And so my natural tendency is to want to protect all of my children from everything for the rest of their lives and keep them safe. But as Jill and I talk about that, we realize it's what we can't do. We can't do that to other children. And for one of the reasons is because that's ultimately about me. I am so fearful and anxious for my other children that I want to protect them, not necessarily for their sake, but for my sake. I can't imagine ever going through anything like this again, so I want to wrap them up and keep them close. But in doing that, they wouldn't be able to live. In my fears, I have to face the fact that I cannot control as much as I love my children with all my heart, but I can't control the outcomes of what they go through. Now, I want to be clear. I don't share all of this with you in order to promote some sort of foolishness or flippancy when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis. The virus is real and significant, and we ought to be very wise and cautious. In fact, to this day, I still get very aggravated when people either come over to my house or invite me to their house, and they're clearly sick, but they didn't bother to tell me. And they'll say things like, oh, I'm not that sick. It's not that big of a deal. And I'm like, well, it kind of is a big deal if you're going to infect me and my family, especially with all that we've been through. We're particularly sensitive to that. So I get the whole washing our hands, isolating, being safe. But I think that the current fears and crisis play in two ways that are wrong. One is the group that says, we must do everything to preserve life at all costs to keep everybody safe and live in absolute terror that something might happen. And here's why this is wrong. One is it's impossible. You cannot self-protect and protect those you love from everything that might potentially happen. You should be wise and cautious, but you don't have that kind of control. And ultimately, everyone is going to die. You might be able to extend life longer, and we should extend and preserve life. Preserving life is a good thing, but it's not the ultimate thing. But there's another side that is erring, and the other side that errs is saying, all that matters is my personal freedom and my personal liberty, and almost throwing caution to the wind in this. Well, I believe this. Just like preservation of life is a good thing, personal liberty is also a very good thing. But if it's all about me and my freedom for my own sake, well, again, this is problematic. It's not the greatest good. And you and I know this. Like, the greatest good is not preservation of life, nor is it personal freedom. The greatest good is love. I mean, Jesus said this, no greater love has any man than this. Than what? Than he lays down his life for his friends. See, our ultimate goal is not to just extend our lives or to have personal liberty. It is to use our life and to use our liberty to love and serve those around us. And we know that there are some things that are far worse than death. Think about in the situation of warfare. A hero will go into danger to lay down his own life to save his friends. But a coward only thinks of his own life, his own preservation, who flees his friends in order to save himself. What is the greater good? The greater good is to love, even if it costs us everything. And this is the message of the gospel, that God himself is a God who loves and gives even to his own cost. And he calls us to follow in the way of Jesus. We should try to preserve life. That is a good thing. We should promote personal liberty and not have people living in bondage. But liberty and life are not oriented toward themselves for their own sake. They are to be given in love for others. You may be able to extend your life another 5 days or 5 more years or 50 more years, but your life will come to an end. And the reality is this: you may gain certain personal liberties or have certain liberties taken away. It is not central that you have unlimited freedom. What is central is what you do with your freedom. Do you use it selfishly or sacrificially to love others? See, the deepest question is not how much longer am I going to live? The deepest question is not how much freedom do I have? The deepest question is how much have I loved? And I want to conclude with this thought. One of the best ways to face our fears and frustrations in these times is to take our eyes off of our current situation, to stop worrying about ourselves, and to practically and simply love sacrificially those that God has placed in our life. That's our calling. Our calling is not freedom. Our calling is not preservation. Our calling is love. So may you follow in the ways of Jesus Christ, our Lord. May you love him and trust him in these uncertain times. And may you give yourself with the days that you have and sacrificially love those around you. God bless.